Red Hat Redemption. We are now on to round two, which will be on immigration, specifically regarding the strain that they allegedly create on the economy, social services, jobs, housing, etc. I honestly thought this part would be a lot shorter, but the more digging I did, the worse the reality showed itself to be, unfortunately. To start, the concern is again a reasonable one. In a nation where economic struggles are becoming more and more prevalent as we find ourselves in yet another recession, yet another war, combined with staggering wealth inequality, that would be enough on its own. But social services are often stretched very thinly to begin with. Finding a job that pays a living wage is a struggle for countless millions, and the housing crisis continues to get worse and worse. And to be fair, there are some areas in which immigration can have a negative effect on these. One recent example that we found thrust heavily into the spotlight in 2025 is that of Springfield, Ohio. Almost overnight, we were hit with allegations of Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs, which of course became an instant meme when Trump went off script during a presidential debate and spread this wild misinformation. The truth of these immigrants, however, was a lot more complicated, as is often almost always the case with real world issues. It is indeed true that their arrival has placed a strain on housing and public services in the town. One big reason for this is the sudden growth. Their population grew to roughly 10 to 15,000 very quickly, which was roughly a quarter of the entire town. And this did have an impact on housing as demand outpaced supply. Other issues that arose were the fact that the legal method by which most Haitian immigrants enter the US does not afford basic medical screenings or immunizations, which led to the need for a testing clinic, and the need for grant funding to assist an influx of students who did not speak English. But what is so often ignored when anti immigration voices mention these issues is the very basic question: is immigration a net negative or positive? Because along with the struggle Springfield has had to deal with, they also encountered many positives. And this part is key. Those positives also helped to alleviate other struggles the town was already facing. For example, its population dropped by over 10% from 2000 to 2018. Its economy dropped by 27% over a similar stretch, and it was described as the unhappiest city in the nation in 2012. Now, there are a big number of reasons for this, but the biggest is likely the deindustrialization trend that hit much of the Rust Belt, which led to a loss of manufacturing jobs. And Haitian immigrants helped to fill many of those holes. To quote one business owner, CEO Ross McGregor, who began hiring many Haitian employees, quote, "We were having a real hard time with people that would apply for a job and then they wouldn't show up on the floor. Or they'd come in and they'd work for half a day and they'd just leave." That is, a real problem when you're running a production facility. You need to have a reliable workforce that you can count on to be at work every day. He also noted that they don't pay them any less than anyone else, and they aren't taking anyone's jobs as a result. Additionally, the Springfield city manager noted, quote, "We've seen more growth than we've seen for decades past, including a revitalization and resurgence of our downtown." This is, of course, just one example, and covering the issue at the level it truly deserves would likely lead to hours worth of video on its own. But I bring it up because anecdotes are effective. And unfortunately, in this case, Springfield was effective in getting a lot of people worked up, especially after sensational and unhinged misinformation began to spread. The eating cats and dogs rumor began on the always fully reliable journalistic source known as social media, referencing a friend of a friend. There were no verified and credible sources. The police had no verified reports, but that didn't stop Vice President J.D. Vance from running wild with it on Twitter. He later clarified by saying, "If I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do." But of course, his admission that this was an entirely made up story did not undo the damage. Blaming minorities and marginalized groups for the issues facing the working class is a tried and true tool of fascism. And fascists are not the kind of group that tends to just reinvent the wheel. The reason they do this is not just to create a boogeyman to attack, but also to deflect from the fact that they are, in fact, the ones often causing these issues on a much greater scale. And this is where I'll begin to briefly shift the focus to where immigration is, in fact, a net positive. A lot of this is going to be stats, so I won't spend a ton of time on the details, but it's important to note all of this because even if the Springfield rumors were real, or even if the panic about Somalian fraud in Minneapolis, for example, was the full truth, it wouldn't change the fact that by and large, immigration is, again, a net positive. To start, I'll reference the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank founded by Ed Crane, Murray Rothbard, and Charles Koch. Anyone who follows politics at a deeper level will likely recognize the latter two, Koch in particular, as staunch conservatives. So, in other words, if there's a bias here, it's likely not in the direction you might be expecting. Now, according to Cato, immigrants are less likely to enter welfare, less likely to remain on it for a long period of time, and less likely to age into the most expensive entitlement programs. As recent as 2023, they consumed 24% less welfare, and with non citizen immigrants specifically, they consumed a whopping 53% less. Immigrants as a whole also consumed 39% less Social Security, 22% less Medicare, 5% less Medicaid, and 34% less SNAP. In another study, Cato found that from 1994 to 2023, they generated more in taxes than they received in benefits from all levels of government, creating a fiscal surplus of $14.5 trillion. Without them, public debt would be at least 205% of GDP. And in fact, they even went as far as to suggest that immigrants may have already prevented a fiscal crisis. A big reason for this surplus is because undocumented immigrants pay into Social Security despite not being able to ever benefit from it in the future. And they also tend to be a younger population on average. And even with housing, they've added $3.7 trillion to US housing wealth. And a big reason for that is similar to the Springfield, Ohio situation. They can often help to halt or reverse population loss in areas where home values had been falling. It is worth noting that immigration can indirectly add some upward pressure to housing prices, and covering all of the intricacies of the housing crisis would probably take a series just as long as this one. But one of the biggest real contributors is that a lack of supply combined with Wall Street treating housing not as a basic human need, but as an investment vehicle. And while recent language from the regime has finally addressed the issue, the actual executive order does not ban institutional investors from buying single family homes. It does not regulate private real estate transactions. And crucially, it does not touch the private capital markets that large institutional investors rely on almost exclusively.
But when I looked more closely at the executive order, there was an exemption carved out just for big home builders to keep selling entire subdivisions directly to Wall Street investors, which conveniently is the same model Bill Pulte invested in before becoming one of Trump's top housing officials.
And all of the false or exaggerated allegations against immigrants are only part of the story, because the unfortunate reality is that this administration is actually the one causing a major strain on the economy, social services, and jobs, and obviously housing, as we just mentioned. And for this series, I'll be specifically limiting the examples to immigration, although, again, the reality is that they're decimating all of the above in countless other ways. Perhaps I'll touch on some of those in a future series. Time will tell. To begin, we're going to touch on law enforcement. So, in this administration's unhinged crusade to deport as many immigrants as possible and hit lofty quotas, they've pulled from all kinds of outside agencies, including local police, National Guard, DEA, ATF, even laughably the Postal Inspection Service and the IRS. Over 33,000 employees have suddenly been deployed towards this goal, the majority of whom are from outside of ICE. And a big, beautiful bill allocated over $170 billion towards additional immigration enforcement. The same bill that cut over $1 trillion from health programs, the largest cut in the history of the nation. And the reckless spending doesn't just end there. ICE has spent over $100 million on advertising alone over 1 year, likely because their methods have been wildly unpopular with the general public. To put some of this absurd spending in perspective, after the doubling of DHS funding and the tripling of ICE funding, they would now be roughly the 16th largest military in the world on their own, just behind Canada and ahead of Italy and Israel. And perhaps most disturbing of all is the massive spending on mega detention centers. We'll get into the moral concerns of these later in section 5, but for the time being, we'll just focus on the economic impact. The cost of just 2 of these alone was $172 million, and that's just the real estate. They still have to pay companies to cover basics like toilets, showers, beds, dining, etc. And there's also the strain to the cities they'll exist in as well, with Social Circle Georgia's city manager noting they only have 17 sworn police officers and an already maxed out water and sewage capacity. Simply put, the infrastructure is often just not there. And as bad as all the big government spending is, it's the strain on the system that might be the most damaging in the long run. Remember when we covered various federal agencies having their employees pulled away to deal with the focus on deportations? Well, as it turns out, FEMA is also under DHS. This is an agency that specifically deals with natural disasters and emergencies, and it needs to be able to act very quickly. But unfortunately, being under DHS also means being under the wildly incompetent Christy Nome, or at least it did until very recently when she was replaced by Mark Wayne Mullen, which has me torn because I was very happy to see her go, but now I need to hear the name Mark Wayne even more frequently. While it would be great if the reason for her replacement was a moral one, it appears likely that it was due to her acknowledging that Trump had personally approved of her spending $220 million in taxpayer money on advertising, which very often featured her. Anyways, if Trump's task force gets its way, FEMA's staff could potentially be cut in half. And while FEMA has certainly had its issues over the years, overstaffing is certainly not one of them. And the ramifications of not just the cuts that already happened, but also having been required to answer to Nome have already begun. We'll see if this changes under Mullen, but for the time being, I'll focus on how things ran under Nome since that covers most of the time up till this point. For just a couple of examples, last year during the Texas floods, FEMA didn't answer roughly two-thirds of the calls to the disaster assistance line. And because every contract of over 100,000 had to be approved by Kristi Noem personally, who is often very busy inserting herself into photo ops, FEMA has been held up quite often already, with over $17 billion in FEMA aid waiting on her approval. And natural disasters have real world impacts. The Texas floods led to at least 135 dead, and this was during a year that was shockingly uneventful overall. Not a single hurricane made landfall all of last year for the first time in a decade. What might happen if that changes? Well, according to over 180 FEMA staffers who warned Congress due to their understaffing, it could potentially lead to a Katrina level disaster. In fact, just this year, we got a potential early preview. When several deadly tornadoes hit the Midwest in early March, local search and rescue crews rushed to the devastated areas to look for survivors when they realized their typical tool that pinpoints the tornado's path of destruction was no longer available. Why? Because the $200,000 contract expired in February, and the request to renew was still moving through Gnome's spending approval process. We'll do it for part two. Next time in part three, we'll be heading into crime, so stay posted and keep an eye out for it.